Hello, hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm going to wait about 1 more minute before we get started. But then we'll go from there. Well, and what do you know? 1 minute has already passed, so we can get started on this because today's topic is a bit dense, but I did try to keep it condensed and easy to follow. But as always, if you do have questions, even in the middle, hopefully it will pop up and alert me. You can always hit the question button at the bottom of your screen, bottom left hand, I believe. You can choose to be anonymous or not, and I'll be happy to answer any questions or go back. Also, if there's any trouble hearing the audio because there's a bit of noise in the background, let me know that too. But without further ado, let's get started. So the topic today, as I mentioned, was dense, is fats explained. So the good, the bad, and the essential. And remember, the weekly mantra, as I try to make it, is that the quality of your calories is what matters. And that also involves fats and the quality of the fats that you're choosing and where they're coming from. So what we'll cover today, and again, I said the topic is dense. We're going to get a little bit nerdy, get a little bit of chemistry discussion going on, just so that the definitions of everything is well understood. That way, when we hear certain buzzwords, it will make hopefully a little more sense. But we're going to talk about what is fat, what is considered, how much is needed each day. Also, the nerdy part comes in where I talk about the different forms of fat, and I'll be defining some of those terms in a little more depth. Of course, probably what you're here for more than the chemistry education is fats and your health, how they might impact your health, which fats impact your health. And since this topic was dense, I didn't want to extend the time of this webinar too long. The debate surrounding fats and oils, I touched on 2 main topics there, but of course, if you have additional questions that can be reserved for maybe a future webinar or at the end here for your questions, I'll be happy to address. So, what is dietary fat? Well, just like protein, when I discussed that earlier on in this year, it's one of the main 3 macronutrients that our bodies use to function, so that it is necessary. And fatty acids, that's the main form of dietary fat, and it primarily exists in foods in the triglyceride form. So that's sort of the structure that it exists when we eat it. There are other forms of dietary fat, but they're less commonly consumed, so I'm focusing mainly on, well, I am focusing only on the fatty acids here. And fats do have various functions in our body. We have hormone production, cell membrane structure, vitamin absorption. There are certain vitamins like A, D, E, and K that we do better. They absorb better when we are eating fats with them. And so that's very useful. That's why I encourage actually full fat salad dressings on salad rather than fat-free dressings, because then you can absorb the vitamins A and K, especially from those vegetables. And then also metabolic processes. So how much fat is needed per day? And it's typically recommended to be about 20 to 35% of your total calories per day. And currently the recommendation for saturated fat, based on the knowledge we have currently, and this will probably change at some point, depending on where research takes us, but less than 10% should be in the form of saturated fat, which is the solid form of fat, animal fats typically, except for a couple plant fats. And again, we'll touch on this more. So at 9 calories per gram, so that's how many calories are in a gram of fat versus the 4 calories for carbohydrates or protein. That equals, for example, in a 2,000 calorie diet, then that's about 44 to 78 total grams of fat, and then less than 22 grams saturated. And for a 1,500 calorie diet, that brings you down to about 33 or 58 total grams of fat and less than 17 grams of saturated fat. So let's get into a little more definition as to what these fats are. So saturated fatty acids, they are saturated with hydrogen atoms. So you can see here the very top saturated fatty acid. This is the sort of an abridged chemical display of what you can expect that to look like. Each one of these little points and valleys here is a carbon atom, and then the hydrogen atoms are sticking off from the sides of them, which is not indicated here, but that's implied. And so when it's saturated with those hydrogen atoms, it leaves no room for these double bonds, which I'll show you in a second with the next one, or kinks in the structure. So it's straight and it's stackable. So if you can imagine Lego bricks being stacked on top of each other, that can form a solid structure. And so they are typically solid at room temperature. Monounsaturated fatty acids, so mono of course means one, and so it's not saturated with hydrogen atoms, but there's only one double bond, which is this structure here. Since there's a hydrogen missing, the carbon atoms are sort of holding hands with each other a second time. So what happens with that is it makes it bend. And that's why you find, since this is not so stackable, imagine having a bunch of those, or we can also talk about polyunsaturated fats with all the bendiness going on because of the double bonds. So polyunsaturated fats, it's more than one of these double bonds. So there's fewer hydrogen atoms attached. And so I wrote more bendy. These form liquids at room temperature because, of course, they're not stackable with all the bends. And so it's more of a flowy liquid form that way. Of course, the monounsaturated fatty acids, they can become solid if they're refrigerated. You might see that sometimes in olive oils if you've ever kept one in the fridge. Polyunsaturated fats, not so much. And polyunsaturated fatty acids are where we find the omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids. And what omega really means is essentially where the first double bond occurs from the end of the tail. So 1, 2, 3 carbons in that double bond, and there's your 3, omega-3. For an omega-6, it would happen a little further back, and then there would be more double bonds further down. Now, as for triglycerides, I'm gonna turn off this laser pointer. As for triglycerides, this is the most common dietary form, as I mentioned earlier. And so it's 3 fatty acids, and they don't have to be the same kind, attached to, this is called a glycerol backbone, if you will. It's also the storage form of fat in your body. And I'm sure you've heard the term triglycerides if you've had lab work done for your blood. So while chemically, I guess you could say it's the same, when we're talking about triglycerides in a lab value for your blood, there are some factors beyond just fat that can affect it. So we're not really going to touch on that today, but I did want to mention that there's a difference in that. Further defining fats. So trans fats were created, well, there are some naturally occurring ones, usually in some dairy products, and those are not the trans fats that we know about and talk about a lot, but they were created in food processing and this is when unsaturated fats undergo hydrogenation or partial hydrogenation by adding hydrogen atoms. So remember, when we're talking about the unsaturated fats, polyunsaturated fats being liquid and bendy, if you're putting hydrogen atoms on, it's going to also change the structure where it's going to make it a little more stackable, a little more flat, thereby essentially turning, you almost want to say, turning an unsaturated fat into a saturated fat artificially. And so now you got the stackable, the margarines, the Crisco, as I have as an example here. However, we found that those were to be harmful, the artificially created ones. It was thought that it would be healthier, of course, when it was originally created, because well, we're using vegetable oils. That has to be healthier than saturated fats. But also, it was a cheaper form of this, of a solid fat. And it was also less likely to oxidize, become rancid. So it was very popular there for a while. Of course, things have changed. We have learned over time through research and continued study that they are not healthy and that they can be very harmful to your health. And so since 2018, the presence of artificially created trans fats in foods in the US is essentially eliminated. And I even looked at a stick of margarine the other day just to see, because it used to show partially hydrogenated, but they could still list the trans fats at 0 because it was less than 0.5 grams per serving. And you can list things as 0 if that's the case. But they had done away with it. So it's virtually eliminated. However, they still can be created if oils are heated to high temperatures, but it depends on the type of oil, the temperature level, and the time heated. So, for example, if there were a restaurant that had a deep fry machine and they were using a vegetable oil and they didn't change it out frequently enough, or they had a very, very high heat, then that's where you could get trans fats created that, of course, wouldn't be listed on labels or really moderated, if you will. So that's why it's always good to change out frying oils or avoid deep frying whenever you can. And I already mentioned that some of these occur naturally, and so those are not the trans fats of concern. The medium chain triglycerides, I wanted to just mention this because I've seen advertisements for MCT oils and what have you there. So they are named medium chain triglycerides for the length of the fatty acid chain. So when you saw that, the medium chain applies for 6 to 12 carbon atoms in a row. And you can find those in coconut oil, palm kernel oil, because medium chain triglycerides are, for all intents and purposes, considered saturated, but they are shorter in chains. And so there are some people who believe they may be more healthy in certain ways. They're certainly more easily absorbable in the gut, and that can be helpful for some people. But the research is still out, but there may be benefits, but at the same time, we're not 100% sure on that. Fats and their impact on health. So now that we've broken free from the chemical structures and everything, let's talk about how they may affect your health. So all dietary fats can help with the absorption of the fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K, like I mentioned before. And for people who are working on weight loss, especially when using weight loss medications like the GLP-1's, the intake of fats in moderate amounts, of course, not high fats, they can actually help reduce the risk of gallstone formation while losing weight. So again, you don't want to do super high fatty diet, but a moderate amount or a reasonable amount with your food may be helpful there. In terms of saturated fat, this is an interesting area because you'd think we knew everything we need to know about saturated fat, but it's still a controversial area and an area of active study because the recommendations for reduced intake are still there because they are associated with, there's an association of high saturated fat intake and cardiovascular risk and mortality. However, it's possible that different types of saturated fats may be beneficial. Like I mentioned, the MCT oils, there may be some benefits there. Also in certain health conditions, it can certainly be beneficial. And saturated fats from dairy may not have as much of an impact on cardiovascular risk or mortality. And really, we determined recently, relatively recently, that saturated fat isn't quite the devil we originally made it out to be. I'm sure everyone remembers the fat-free crazes and how everything was low fat, no fat, and that was the thing to do. But as you may remember, if you listened to my commentary about sweeteners and sugar, the low fat, no fat often translated to added sugars. And the health of the nation really didn't change much at all. And so it's also believed that, of course, sugars may have an impact on your health, and even in terms of cardiovascular risk. But saturated fats in processed items, baked goods, the more processing involved, those may be the more harmful saturated fats, but it's still, again, an active area of study. Moving on to monounsaturated fats. So replacing saturated fat with monounsaturated fats does show a reduction in LDL cholesterol, which is considered the bad cholesterol in general, and triglycerides, the blood triglycerides. They may improve insulin sensitivity. They tend to be more stable at high heat versus the polyunsaturated fats. And some sources I listed here, of course, were some olive oil, avocado oil, sesame, peanut oil, canola oil, and high oleic safflower and sunflower oils, as well as peanuts in general, tree nuts, and seeds. Then moving on to polyunsaturated fats, these are associated with a decreased risk of cardiovascular disease. They may help with brain health. You know, there's talk of the Mediterranean diet that has fatty fish and all the omegas, and brain health, prevention of Alzheimer's. And so that's an area that's being looked into. And they may help reduce inflammation in the body. Now, like I had mentioned about the omegas, so essential fatty acids, those are the fatty acids that are essential for our health, but they cannot be made in the body. And those are the omega-3s, alpha linoleic acid, especially. And so those are found in fatty fish, ground flaxseed, chia and hemp seeds. There's some eggs that get supplemented, like chickens get supplemented with omegas. And so then you can find them in the eggs, as well as walnuts. And so the ALA, the alpha linolenic acid, you can find that from some of the plant sources. And then DHA and EPA, those are more or less determined to be conditionally essential. So our body can make them, but not in the quantities that seem to be for our benefit. And so you may hear people recommend DHA, EPA, and that's where the fish oils tend to come into play for people who might not eat enough fatty fish. Of course, again, there's some debate as to how healthy are the omega-3 supplements, and for some people, they seem to be more beneficial than others. Omega-6, those are found in safflower, grapeseed, sunflower, wheat germ, corn, walnut, and cottonseed oils. And linoleic acid, which is the main omega-6 consumed in the Western diet. And one thing I'll mention is there does seem to be a debate about omega-6 versus omega-3. And it does seem to be that, again, people are concerned about omega-6 because there is a hypothesis that it's pro-inflammatory. But in reality, it may be more about the ratio. So more omega-3 and not really needing to change the level of omega-6 may help prevent any pro-inflammation that could occur. Also, again, like I had mentioned about saturated fats and which ones may be better or worse, the omega-6s that can also commonly occur in processed foods, maybe it's more about the fact that it's a processed food versus the omega-6 fatty acid. And again, an area of active study, but I wanted to let you know sort of where we are on that. And I suppose I should pause and say, if you are wary about any of these, there's nothing that says you absolutely have to eat a specific vegetable oil or plant oil. And so you have the right to avoid something if it makes you uncomfortable. This is an image that I wanted to display because we're talking about foods that have fatty acids and which ones and how much. And so here's a list of examples that show which ones are higher in saturated fats, such as the coconut oil, butter at the bottom, palm oil as well, lard, of course, and also The red is for monounsaturated fatty acids, which may surprise you to see that there actually are monounsaturated fatty acids in things like butter. But like I said, those triglycerides, they come with fatty acids that aren't always the same. So you will see a variety of different fats. Normally, when we talk about if we're labeling one like an olive oil as a monounsaturated fat, that's just because there is so much more of that percentage-wise. So you can see the comparisons here. So a couple of hot topics. Again, I only chose a couple because I wanted to be mindful of time. And like I said, it's a dense topic. And in who knows, in a month, maybe these hot topics, there will be new answers. And so I wanted to start out here. But if you have other burning questions, happy to either answer them here or potentially later, because it's an area that I want to always try to stay as up to date as possible. So the first one that people may hear are seed oils are unhealthy. So the claim is that seed oils such as canola, soybean, corn, or sunflower are unhealthy because they're high in the pro-inflammatory omega-6s and overly processed. So my take is that yes, seed oils are higher in omega-6 fatty acids, but as long as you have a balanced intake of other fatty acids with the omega-3s, omega-6 is still essential and can be good for you. Also, I think one of the primary concerns with seed oils is the processing and how they're being obtained and extracted, because it's usually done with high heat or certain chemicals. And so cold pressed seed oils, they have there's less processing going on. Doesn't mean that they're more expensive, but they will retain more of the healthy nutrient content that we're seeking. A second hot topic is there are people who claim that saturated fat doesn't matter in any way whatsoever. We should stop caring so much. Butter on everything. And so the claim is that saturated fat doesn't have any impact on cardiovascular health. And this is an area where is still hotly debated. In fact, I believe I do know a dietitian who she does not care about saturated fatty levels. And I appreciate her input because I think it's important to challenge the status quo and always question and pursue what the research shows. And this is still a debated topic. As I mentioned before, processed foods with saturated fats might be the bigger concern versus whole foods. But where we stand right now, and it's hard to make this pendulum move sometimes, but where we stand right now, based on the research we have right now, is that it's still best for current recommendations to be less than 10% of calories and use the unsaturated fats more often. So putting it together, dietary fats are an essential part of your diet. The fat-free is a craze that I'm glad is basically gone. The majority of your dietary fats should come from mono and polyunsaturated sources whenever possible. Saturated fat in moderation, though, can still be a part of a healthy diet. And like I said, this area, even though fat and fatty acids have been with us since the dawn of time, it's still an area that's being actively studied and new information is constantly being discovered. And so now I leave it open to you, and you can ask questions about this topic or any other nutrition related topic if you have one. But thank you for sticking with me through some of this dense material. And I hope that you found it to be helpful or maybe enlightening. And of course, again, if you do have a question, you can find the Q&A at the bottom left hand of your screen. Feel free to make yourself anonymous, or if you leave your name, I'll probably just say it out loud so that you know that I'm addressing your specific question. And of course, if you don't have any questions, that's fine too. while I wait here for a bit, another fast fact is that today is actually National RD, Registered Dietitian Day. So I couldn't think of a better way to celebrate than get to talk about one of these topics today. And so glad that you could join me. Something else I will mention is if you ever have a topic that you think might be worthy of a webinar or you'd like to have discussed or touched on, feel free to volunteer that. You can let the staff at Premier Weight Loss know, or you can send me a message. But I'm always happy to look into the topics that interest you. I find these topics interesting for myself and a good challenge, but I'm always ready and willing to answer questions or address topics that are important to you. So always feel free to let us know. See here. It's currently 6:27. I haven't seen any questions come up, and that's fine. I will probably wait about 1 more minute. Oh, Maria, thank you. Thank you. Happy RD Day. I appreciate that so much. It was a sunny, beautiful, warm day, so I couldn't have asked for anything better. And will this PowerPoint be available in printout form? I can make it so. I'd be happy to send a copy and create that for you to have on hand. What I can do, Mary Ann, is I can send that to the Premier Weight Loss staff, or if they give me your contact information, I can send it to you. Be happy to print it out and give it to you. That's not a problem at all. In fact, I'll write a note to myself to do that. It is quite a few, it's pretty, like I said, dense material, so it's a lot of words and very few slides. So I can understand wanting to have it printed out. So yes, I'll make sure that we can make that happen for you. Well, I think with that, let me see here. Oh, Marianne, you're very welcome. Thanks for this information in your presentation. You're very welcome. I'm actually quite proud of this presentation. It requires a lot of, I don't want to say effort necessarily, but it's one of those things that I'm so grateful that I could do, because it's very worthwhile. I'm proud of how it turned out. So thank you. Without further ado, I hope you two get to enjoy the outdoors as well. It's absolutely gorgeous outside. So thank you for joining. And if there's anything else that comes up, or if you think of questions later, feel free to send an email to the staff and I will get back to you. Have a lovely evening.